Picture this. It's February 1952, and a massive blizzard is bearing down on a remote Inuit camp near Igloolik in the Canadian Arctic. Specifically at a traditional hunting ground called Avaja, about 15 kilometers inland from the Fox Basin coast. And while a group of young hunters are frantically throwing together modern canvas tents they de-bought from the trading post in Pond Inlet, convinced their new equipment would save them. An elderly man named Anaktuk Kidusuk, which means the wind in Inuktitut, quietly watching them with knowing eyes, saying nothing as they dismiss his offer to help. Now, I need to tell you something important right at the start. This story was documented by Father Andre Steinman, a Catholic missionary who was stationed at the Igloolik mission from 1949 to 1957, and he recorded this entire event in his personal journals, which are now kept in the archives of the Oblate Order in Ottawa. And he interviewed all 7 men involved just days after the storm ended. So everything I'm about to tell you actually happened to real people in a real place. And the details are so vivid because Father Steinman was meticulous about recording the Inuit people's stories and experiences during his time in the Arctic. The radio had crackled warnings about temperatures dropping to negative 50 degrees Celsius with winds that could tear the skin off your face. And rescue wouldn't be possible for at least a week, maybe 2, if the storm was as bad as the forecasters predicted from the Royal Canadian Air Force Station at Resolute Bay. And here's where this story gets absolutely incredible. By the time that blizzard finally passed, those young hunters would be crowded into Anaktuk's shelter, humbled and shivering, learning a lesson about survival that their ancestors had perfected over thousands of years, but that they almost lost in just one generation. Anaktuk Kidusuk was 72 years old at the time, born in 1880 during a caribou hunt near what's now called Repulse Bay. And according to Father Steinman's notes, Anaktuk had survived at least 40 major Arctic storms in his lifetime, had built over 300 igloos, and was considered one of the last true masters of traditional survival skills in the entire Igloolik region. And his knowledge wasn't just personal experience, it was the accumulated wisdom of his grandfather, his father Kidusuk, and countless ancestors stretching back into the mists of time before Europeans ever set foot in the Arctic. Now, before we dive into how this happened, I need you to understand just how deadly serious this situation was. Because this wasn't some casual camping trip gone wrong, this was life or death in an environment where your eyelashes freeze together when you blink, where exposed skin develops frostbite in under 2 minutes, and where the wind doesn't just howl. It screams like a living thing trying to claw its way into your soul. The young hunters were Kutu Tek2, age 23, Silas Arnatsiak, age 9, Matthias Yukatanwak, age 26, Inoki Urkatuk, age 28, Joshua Kunuk, age 22, and Peter Tapardi, age 24. These weren't just random names. These were real men with families back in Igloolik who were waiting for them to return from what was supposed to be a routine seal hunting trip along the Fox Basin coast. Father Steinman wrote in his journal dated February 18, 1952, "The 6 young men returned today with Anaktuk, and they are changed, men humbled, grateful, and speaking with reverence about knowledge they had dismissed just 1 week ago." And he went on to interview each one separately to get their individual perspectives on what happened out there at Avaja during those 6 terrifying days and nights. The young hunters, who had grown up in a transitional time when traditional knowledge was being replaced by Southern goods and methods, believed that newer automatically meant better, that canvas and kerosene heaters would outperform the old ways their grandparents had used. And honestly, who could blame them when the world was changing so fast and the Hudson S. Bay Company store in Pond Inlet had all these modern supplies that seemed so much easier than the old methods? But Anaktuk, who, according to the 1950 Canadian census records, was living with his wife, Arnok, and grandson Paluzi in a traditional sod house at something these young men had forgotten, that the old ways were Iantis traditions to be preserved in museums. They were technologies refined through thousands of years of trial and error, paid for with the lives of those who got it wrong, and perfected by those who survived to pass on their knowledge to the next generation, who would need it to survive in one of the harshest environments on planet Earth. The young hunters had finished setting up their canvas tents by now, and they'd lashed everything down as tight as they possibly could, using every stake and rope they had. But if you'd been there watching both camps take shape at Avaja that evening, around 8 o'clock, you would have noticed something interesting that would prove crucial in the hours to come. An X6 igloo was being built into the landscape, nestled carefully against the rise where the prevailing north-northwest winds that always come before major storms in that region would break around it rather than hitting it head-on, while the canvas tent stood exposed on flatter ground where the wind would have nothing whatsoever to slow it down or deflect it. Inside their tents, the hunters had their Coleman kerosene heaters burning at full capacity, and initially it felt warm and cozy, and they were cooking seal meat they'd caught earlier that day and making tea. Confident they'd made the right choice with their modern equipment that had cost them most of a season's worth of fox pelts to purchase from the trading post. And honestly, at that point, around 8 or 9 p.m., it did seem like they had the better setup. After all, they were warm with minimal effort, while old Anakutik was still outside working in the growing cold as darkness fell completely and the storm advanced. Winds began to pick up and the temperature dropped to negative 35 degrees Celsius according to the readings that came later from the Resolute Bay weather station. But here's what they didn't understand about heat and shelter in extreme Arctic cold. And this is where thousands of years of accumulated Inuit wisdom becomes visible. An undeniable canvas is porous. It breathes. Pitch is actually great for preventing condensation in mild weather conditions, but absolutely catastrophic in Arctic storm conditions because it allows wind to penetrate right through the fabric. And even a small amount of wind moving through fabric will strip away heat faster than any portable kerosene heater can possibly replace it, no matter how high you turn up the flame. Matthias Ukatunawak, age 26, later told Father Steinman in his interview, recorded on February 20th. By 9 o'clock that night at Avaj, even with the Coleman heater burning as high as we could safely run it without risking carbon monoxide poisoning, we could feel the cold coming through the tent walls like water seeping through cloth, and we started to worry. But we were too proud to go to Anakutik, yet we kept thinking it would get better, that our modern equipment would work if we just gave it more time and burned more fuel. Meanwhile, a properly built igloo is essentially completely windproof, and the snow itself, filled with millions of trapped air pockets, is an incredible insulator, with thermal properties that Father Steinman compared in his notes to the finest insulation materials available in modern construction in southern Canada. By 10 o'clock that night, Anakutik had completed the dome of his igloo at Avija, the block spiraling up and inward in perfect geometric precision until he deplaced the final keystone block at the very top. And then he did something that Father Steinman witnessed himself when he visited the site 2 weeks later and asked Anakutik to demonstrate the complete technique. He went inside through the entrance tunnel and lit a small kudlik, which is a traditional seal oil lamp carved from soapstone that had belonged to his grandmother and had been in his family for probably over 100 years, and he let it burn for about 20 minutes, while he carefully watched the interior surface of the snow blocks with the practiced eye of a master craftsman. What was happening inside that igloo was beautiful and essential to its function. And Anoki Erkatuk, who was 28 and the oldest of the young hunters, described it to Father Steinman this way in his interview. When we finally went to Anakutik's igloo the next day, after our tents nearly collapsed, we saw that the inside walls were glazed with a thin layer of ice, smooth and shiny like glass or a mirror. And Anakutik explained to us that he deliberately melted the inside surface just a little bit with the heat from the seal oil lamp and then let it freeze solid again when he let cold air in, and this created a perfect seal that kept all the heat inside it. Was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And none of us knew how to do it, even though our grandfathers all knew this technique. The storm was supposed to hit around midnight, according to the weather reports from the Royal Canadian Air Force Station at Resolute Bay. And the temperature had already dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius by late afternoon when the group made their decision to set up camp at Avija rather than try to push on to the next settlement. And this is where you need to pay attention, because the difference in their approaches reveals something profound about how we think about survival and technology, even today. The 6 young hunters worked together to pitch 3 canvas tents, the kind you could buy from the Hudson's Bay Company for about $40 at the time, which was a lot of money. Nearly a whole season's worth of fox pelton, they staked them down as best they could, piling rocks on the corners and guy lines, setting up their portable Coleman kerosene heaters inside, arranging their sleeping bags and supplies with the efficiency of people who'd been camping their whole lives. And they felt prepared. They genuinely believed they had modern equipment, plenty of fuel, and the confidence that comes from youth combined with inexperience of truly life-threatening situations. Meanwhile, Anakutik had walked about 30 meters away to where the snow had drifted deep against a small rise in the terrain at Avija, and he began to work alone in the fading Arctic twilight. And if you'd been watching him, you might have wondered what this old man was doing. Moving slowly but deliberately, reading the snow the way you'd read a book, pressing it with his sealskin mittens that his wife Arnok had sewn for him with caribou sinew, nodding to himself as if the landscape was telling him secrets that no one else could hear. According to Kutu Taktu's account, to Father Steinman recorded on February 18, 1952, Anakutik looked at the snow like he was having a conversation with it, touching it, sometimes putting his ear close to it. And we thought maybe the old man was getting confused in his age, but we were the confused ones, not him. He understood that snow in ways we'd forgotten. Here's what made Anakutik different from those young hunters. And this is the key to understanding why this story matters. He wasn't just building a shelter. He was working with the environment instead of against it, using principles of thermodynamics and structural engineering that he learned not from textbooks but from a lifetime of observation and the accumulated knowledge passed down from his father, Kaidasak, and his grandfather, Ivolu, both legendary hunters in their time around Iglulik and the Fox Basin. While the young men had brought their shelter with them and were trying to impose it on the landscape, Anakduk was about to create his shelter from the landscape itself, and the difference between these two philosophies would become crystal clear when that storm hit. Avijah with the force of a freight train, and the temperature plummeted to negative 53 degrees Celsius, and the wind reached speeds over 100 kilometers per hour. But none of the young hunters were worried yet, and in fact, Kutu, that 23-year-old from Iglulik who would later become a respected elder himself, and tell this story to his own grandchildren for decades until his death in 1998, actually laughed and called out to Anakuk, asking if the old man needed help with his snow house. The mockery, gentle but real. The kind of teasing that comes from not knowing what you don't know. And Anakduk just smiled according to all the accounts. That patient smile of elders everywhere who've seen this pattern before, who know that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. And he kept working as the light began to fade completely and the first fingers of wind began to probe at their camp, there at Avijah. What Anakduk Kaidasak was building was just any Igluit, was a masterpiece of thermal engineering that would make modern architects weep with envy. And I want you to understand exactly what made his approach so brilliant, because Father Steinman actually measured and documented the dimensions and construction techniques in his journals, sketching detailed diagrams and recording temperatures with a thermometer he'd brought from the mission. Fascinated by what he was witnessing when he visited the site at Avijah 2 weeks later and asked Anakuk to demonstrate his techniques, he started by testing the snow. And this is crucial, not all snow is created equal when it comes to building. And Anakduk was looking for what the Inuit call puke snow, that has been on the ground long enough to bond and compress, but not so long that it has turned to solid ice. And he found it in a drift that had formed against the rise at Avijah, snow with the right density and structure to be cut into blocks that would hold their shape and provide proper insulation against the brutal Arctic cold. According to Father Steinman's measurements, recorded on February 19, 1952, each block that Anakduk cut was roughly 60 centimeters long, 40 centimeters high, and 20 centimeters thick. And he just cut them. Randomly, he was creating them in a precise spiral pattern using a traditional snow knife made from caribou bone that his father Kaidasak had given him back in 1895. A knife that was itself probably 50 years old even then. Worn smooth by decades of use, but still perfectly functional and sharp enough to slice through compacted snow like butter. Silas Arnasiak, the 19-year-old hunter from Iglulik, told Father Steinman in his interview on February 19th. I watched Anakduk cut those blocks, and I realized with shame that I didn't know how to do it properly. My father had tried to teach me when I was young, maybe 10 or 11 years old. But I thought I did need to learn because we had tents from the Hudson Bay store. And now I was watching this knowledge that's thousands of years old, and realizing it might die with Anakduk and his generation if we do want to pay attention and learn while we still can. The igloo that Anakduk built that day at Avijah was 3 meters in diameter at the base, according to Father Steinman's careful notes, with walls that curved inward in a mathematically perfect spiral to form a dome about 2 meters high at the center. And as he worked methodically in the growing darkness and cold, he was also creating a trench in the snow that would become what's called the cold sink, a depression where the heaviest cold air would naturally settle due to physics, keeping the living space above it relatively warmer through principles that the Inuit had understood for millennia before Western science gave it names and formulas and equations.